Welcome to Psychologist Talks. Today is a second episode in a series about masculinity. In today's episode, I'm going to be sharing a little bit about myself. Now, the reason for this, if you didn't watch the first episode, is I think we need to have more open conversations about how we encounter our identities, particularly as men. I think men need to do an especially better job at this sort of thing. But it really doesn't, it's not exclusive to men. I think we all need to do a better job talking about how we encounter different parts of our identities, because that's how we learn from one another. Of like, well, how might this apply to me? So we'll see. This might have some similarities to your story. Maybe it'll have some differences. Regardless, though, I hope that it is informative. And just, if I had to encourage anything from, anyone viewing this, just kind of consider, how this helps you conceptualize what masculinity can look like or could look like, what you would like it to look like, and just kind of go from there. So, this episode's going to have probably some overlaps with other areas because you can't really talk about masculinity without talking about other aspects of identity. So we'll see where this goes. And why do I give that caveat? I don't know. Probably because I've talking about my depression, et cetera, on other episodes. So, I guess what I'm struggling with in this moment is like, what in this episode will be unique to masculinity versus what is, in essence, just a story about me, because masculinity is a core identity. Gender is all around us. Anyway, possibly a fruitless point of pause. So I'll just proceed. So I grew up, one important context is I grew up in Texas, most of my upbringing. If you're not from the States, Texas is, I would argue, a far more masculine heavy, like a little bit more hyper masculine area to grow up in. We're not cowboys and horses. However, I think the masculinity in the South is a little bit more towards like grit, a little bit more towards less emotionality, kind of getting things done, working hard. There's a big emphasis on like sports and physicality. And so, I think that, even regionally, you're going to have your own unique manifestations of masculinity. Now, I'm not conscious of this, right? This is not, nobody's telling me this, but looking back, that is an important kind of contextual factor growing up in Texas. I was very briefly in Colorado, but mostly growing up in Texas. Now, the other intersection is that I think is really important when we talk about like gender and pulls between masculinity and femininity is genetics. We talk about like temperament, and this has implications for how our personalities develop. Looking back, it's really interesting if you talk to me when I was 18 or 25 and asked me like, how emotional are you as a human being? I would tell you like, I don't have many emotions at all. I'm highly contained. I feel very few things. There was even this audacious moment in grad school. And in grad school, I was really starting to evolve, I think, for the first time not first time in my life, but for the first time in a long time. But even during early grad school, it was my first year, I was working in an inpatient unit, and somebody was talking about transference and stuff, and I was like, I don't really feel anything towards my clients. I'm so good at containment. I don't have a lot going on internally. And And what's so interesting about this is, one, that's not how human beings work. That's why I say it was somewhat of an audacious claim for me. But now looking back, au contraire, I was a highly sensitive kid, highly sensitive kid. I convinced myself over time, because I didn't know how to deal with my emotions healthily in a way that didn't feel harmful to me. I'd convinced myself I was this sort of hyper-logical human being. But in reality, I was very, very sensitive as a kid. High levels of emotional reactivity. I would get upset very, very easily. I would get sad very, very easily. And it would just, it was boiling within. The challenge is I was in an environment, and this is not of any particular fault to my parents, but I don't think they were necessarily equipped or ready for a really sensitive kid. And so they didn't really teach me a lot of fruitful ways of how to encounter that high degree of emotionality. Now, this is where those two worlds intersect. I'm also a boy. And so there's a little bit less kind of societal or kind of gender role sort of pressure to teach me how to encounter my emotions more fruitfully. I very much wonder if I had been born a girl, if there would have been a much different response to me. Whereas because I was a boy growing up with a family heritage that tends to have their relationship with being a male and masculinity is less emotionality, they just kind of pulled back a little bit and was like, well, he'll just kind of figure his stuff out. It's not like they were highly unsupportive by any stretch of the imagination, but I just don't think that they were as intentional as they could have been. Because they're like, oh God, there was this highly sensitive kid. We're just going to do the best we can with him. Versus like, ooh, we need to do something different with this kid. And so that's like the first encountering with masculinity. Is there's this undertone that I'm not being something. I'm not being what I'm supposed to be. There's something wrong with me, essentially. That this emotionality is not supposed to be here, and there's nowhere for me to put it, so something must be wrong. And I think this is one of the most dangerous things with masculinity. I alluded to this, if not directly stated it in the first episode, is like emotionality is not a bad thing with masculinity. However, there can be a bit of a rub if you're a more emotional creature, but you identify more from a masculine lens, because then there might be a little bit of a mismatch depending on where society is at with masculinity. When I was growing up in the 80s and 90s, it's like you're not going to be an emotional creature, and so there's a disconnect. I also wasn't availed, though, like it's okay to be a more feminine male. There's no conversation about that whatsoever. So I also wasn't given an alternative. Because maybe the answer isn't. Maybe the answer could be that more emotional creatures tend to lean a little bit more towards femininity. Not always, but maybe there's more of a trend in that direction. But I wasn't given that allowance. I was supposed to be a male. I was supposed to be a masculine creature, but I had this discrepant internal world and external world. But over time, I was like, I gotta stop having an external world because me making this emotionality external is dangerous. I'm going to get rejected for it, or I'm just going to struggle emotionally and I'm not going to get the support that I'm looking for, although I don't even know what I'm looking for, right? Whereas I think if I was given that option of like, hey, maybe, femininity holds answers, because within femininity, there's like embrace your emotions, work through your emotions. It's okay to express your emotions. I think this has been changing over time, but again, for me, that was the first big rub. And a lot of this, it really is, I think, the central point. Because as I got older, I began to control myself more emotionally, I had to figure out, like, okay, so how do I fit in? Well, what's left over is, like, physicality. So I got involved in sports quite a bit. And it's not that I didn't like sports. I mean, it really wasn't a bad thing. Not for me. I mean, I think there's a lot of enjoyment in the aspect of sports. There's like these cool skill sets of throwing and catching and hitting and shooting, all these sorts of things. The biggest issue, though, for me was like performance anxiety. Like I would enjoy certain sports more than others. But I only enjoyed them like playing around, because the minute I had to do anything competitive, I would like panic. I was a total crap time. It was horrible. And so I know sometimes people are like, oh, of course you force a boy into sports. Why would you do that? They shouldn't have to do sports. And I'm like, well, sports aren't inherently bad. I just, I wish there were more milieus for them not to be competitive, particularly for like really anxious kids. Now, granted, again, much like my emotionality, anxiety didn't really have a place to live either. But it tainted, even if I think I had a healthier relationship with anxiety, I think I would have preferred not to be so competitive. I just enjoyed doing the thing. I didn't really enjoy competing with the thing. Or I don't know, maybe if I, this is like going down memory lane, which in the first episode, would I say history lane? I figured it out. Excuse me. Going down memory lane, like, well, maybe though, if I gotten past my performance anxiety, maybe I really would have enjoyed competing. Who knows? There's no way to tell. Can't turn back time. So anyway, I tried the physicality side, and that didn't work for me because I was supposed to perform as well. So boom, another failure, right? So I'm already highly emotional, boom, failure in masculinity. I try to be physical, boom, massive failure. And I have these really stark memories. I mean, very stark memories of just like not measuring up to other boys and their skill sets. Having what I assume was a panic attack. I'd never had asthma during a soccer match. I was so anxious I would lean into pitches. Like instead of pulling back if I thought the ball was coming, I'd jump in front of the base so the ball would go behind me. I'm sure people were looking at me like I was crazy, which did not help my anxiety. I remember getting the wind knocked out of me and getting tearful in football when a kid who was shorter than me, helmet went straight into the diaphragm area and like lower chest and knocked the living wind out of me. I still remember when I play, the shots that I would miss, what few I would make because the coaches were wise enough to see I couldn't perform live very well. I was also tall and very skinny, so I could be knocked over like in 2 seconds flat. So I mean, just like tons of really not great memories that at the core, the issue is like it is a failure of my identity, how I internalize masculinity. There's some intrinsic failure there, and so I'm emotionally failing, I'm physically failing, and so what I had left, which is one of the privileges of masculinity and particularly being a male, is like, well, I'll just do the knowledge thing, right? I'll be smart. I'll know things. Now, the danger in this is that there's nothing wrong with intelligence. The danger is knowing and a knowing mentality of prescribing sort of like a perfectionism to that knowing. Of like, I'm just going to know all the facts. And latent to that means I can't be wrong. Like there's going to be a right and a wrong. I can acquire the knowledge or I don't have the knowledge. And so another false dichotomy is formed where it's like, well, I'm going to lean on knowledge, which I can do, and I did quite successfully. But there was still tons of fear, tons of anxieties, tons of sort of performance elements that of like, well, I have to know and I have to do extremely well or I'm going to be a failure. And this is where that underlying sensitivity is still not being managed because I didn't just like stoically engage in knowledge. I anxiously engaged in knowledge. And so it's why, like, when I encountered challenges in math, I was a molecular biology major and I hit calculus and I couldn't do it right out the gates. I already started having trouble in late high school with algebra 3 or pre-calc or something like that. I started having trouble and I couldn't get it. And so I dropped out. I didn't drop out of school, sorry. I dropped out of the program and switched my degree to psychology, which ended up being a great decision. I very much enjoy, but it was... it was accidental, right? It was my own sort of lack of belief in myself that took me out of molecular biology. That sort of underlying sensitivity, like, oh no, something's wrong with me. Oh, I'm failing again. I can't feel this. I can't feel this. I don't know what to do with this. Okay, I'm just gonna quit. I'm gonna run away from this. And so hopefully that helps kind of convey, like, if masculinity, I think, had been framed differently for me, and or had I been given more allowances to be a more feminine creature, I think I would have had a lot less struggle all the way through college of like understanding who I was. Like maybe I could have sought more feminine endeavors, or if people appreciated the kind of more feminine aspects of me, that I'm wanting to be expressive and I'm wanting lots of back and forth and like direct communication so I know where I relationally stand with people, that someone could have nurtured that and been like, yeah, he's a boy, but, we can help him out emotionally. There's nothing wrong with that. And you don't have to only pursue physicality or knowledge. There's other things. There's nurturing that you could do. Like, it's a different way of saying that is like, I landed in a field of nurturing through freaking accident. Yeah, like, I did not get here through any, just dumb luck is how I got to a profession that means so very much to me, when that could have been nurtured. It could have been nurtured at a really young age had the definitions of masculinity been more expansive, and or had the definitions of femininity been more allowable. To this day, if you were to ask me, am I more of a feminine creature than a masculine creature, I would say yes. I am, I'd say it's like 60-40, so 60% feminine, kind of 40% more masculine. How have I arrived upon that? I don't know. I guess I'm kind of jumping too far ahead. The other consequence of all this, I said through college, one of the really challenging things is I'm divorced, and a big piece of what finally got me to connect more with myself is looking back on that wreckage, going like, what the hell happened? And it was not all me. But I will say, like, my emotional and relational stuntedness, which is a big issue with masculinity, because there's not often a lot of teaching around that. There's more teaching to other really healthy aspects of masculinity. But there is not often. There can be and there should be lots of teaching to how you encounter your emotions more fruitfully and how you encounter relationships more fruitfully. But I was highly stunted in that, and I didn't know how to operate in a marriage. And when someone's engaging me emotionally, like I'm just like, oh God, what do I do with this? Because I get really uncomfortable. I have those feelings that I felt when I was younger of just panic, of like, there are these overwhelming emotions and I don't know what to do with them, and they just eat me alive. And then I'll get defensive, or I'll get upset, or whatever it might be, when I reach sort of a limit or a threshold, being like, I can't deal with this. Like, stop, leave me alone. I do not know what to do with this. And it feels like people are attacking me. When in reality, it's just like, no, you're having a normal emotion and you need to figure out how to port that out outside of you and actually confront and express yourself proactively, in fact, and actually relate to people openly and actually convey who you are, rather than act as this sort of intellectual enigma where I'd just let people project onto me because that was more comfortable. Like, I'll just be whatever you want me to be. And then that way I don't have the anxiety of being who I actually am. And all of this, again, is this kind of distorted notion of masculinity. I need to be the rock. The rock is where it's going to be safe, so I'm emotionally shut down. Relationally, I will engage, but I need to be engaged first so I can basically just mirror and mimic. And meanwhile, I'm going to default on knowing. And if I know things and I'm doing things right, then things are going to be good. And then if they're wrong, then, oh, holy crap, panic time. And how can I jump ship to avoid being wrong? It just became this really distorted, really unhealthy way of encountering my own identity. After the divorce and everything that kind of followed, I think, was this really challenging point of introspection. And this is when I think I realized all of these things and was like, oh my God, like how did me, this allegedly smart guy, who is I'm a stoic, non-emotional guy, how did I get to this point? Because holy cow, did I screw the pooch on this? Like, I just blew up my life. What did I, this is how I arrived upon this. Now, the early kind of understanding of this did not attach it to masculinity and femininity. It was just like, oh, I am emotionally and relationally stunted, and I need to find a way to connect with people authentically and openly. And part of the challenge of that is like, oh God, I've got all these really powerful emotions too, and I have to figure out how to wield those effectively. One of the challenges, though, to this very day, is that internal expectation around emotions is still held by the world around me. People will put all sorts of stuff on me as a male. I know I have lots of privileges as a male, but they see me as through the lens of being a male and masculinity, and within that they will assume that there's not going to be a lot of emotion, and people get surprised when there's emotion to anything that I offer. And or when I express emotion, it is often seen through the lens of like anger or this sort of fervor that is not at all touched by anxiety. Now, part of that is my own doing because, I'm not very emotionally practiced. I've only been doing this for about a decade now of actually like fruitfully leaning into my emotions. And so, some of that's my responsibility of how I convey myself. But there still is this like, well, if a male's being confident and firm, then it must be aggressive. And it's like, there's no way I'm coming across as aggressive every time I just like convey myself. There's no way. And so some of that's just the world projecting onto me of like, you're not an emotional creature, but if you're an emotional creature, you're probably going to be angry or you're going to be overly assertive or something like that. It's like, no, I feel sorrow in this moment, or no, I feel incredible anxiety in this moment, or heaven forbid, a mixture of emotions all at once. I can be frustrated and still hurt at the same time. Just because I'm frustrated doesn't mean I'm entitled, right? So there's still this thing that society does with masculinity, particularly with men, that is incredibly unfair and puts us in this spot that almost reinforces and encourages an emotional disconnect. It's kind of have your cake and eat it too sort of thing of like, well, we expect you to be more emotional, but when you're more emotional, you're going to be seen as like dangerous. We're not going to really extend too much latitude of actually trying to understand what you're thinking or feeling. We're just going to make assumptions about you. It's also really interesting being in the psychological profession because there's all sorts of stuff put on us as men. It's like, well, you're going to be less emotional. We're not going to share as much with you. I think a lot of people, like the amount of time that is required to build trust and rapport and get people to actually give more of their internal world to me takes much longer. Which is frustrating for me because I feel like so much of my kind of feminine self is wanting that and doing things in the service of that. But it's like trying to burst out of like a shell every time I meet with somebody. I would love to have some people just be like project. I know I hear women complain about this. It's like they get projected on of like, well, they're going to want to hear emotions. And so they're put in these uncomfortable positions where people are talking way too emotionally with them and projecting on stuff onto them. In some ways, I would love for some of that on my defense. In reality, we probably all want a greater degree of balance in our lives and with our identities. But for me, it's like every time I'm having to be like, trust me, I'm not the stereotype. I'm not this stereotype. Like, please see me as an individual human being. I have a lot more breadth and depth than I think you give me credit for. Now, I want to caveat that, I'm not saying everybody does this with me, but it is this really interesting encountering that like, even as I've discovered myself to be a more feminine creature, there still is this expectation towards masculinity, and it to this very day it just creates this rub, and it takes a lot for me to kind of contain that because my history is to defend and to go down unhealthy patterns, and so I am constantly pushing against the world that seems to encourage me to revert back to those methodologies, and it's kind of a mind screw in a way. I almost said the F-bomb, but I forget the language, 18 or below language allowed on these platforms. But it's a bit of a mind screw of like, I can imagine for a lot of men and a lot of masculine creatures in this world that this sort of, there's this push to be something different, but then there's the simultaneous feel as though they don't really want you to behave in that way. Like, I want you to be more emotional, but I kind of don't. Or if you are, you need to be really good at it because the minute there's any sort of misunderstanding, you're going to be seen as potentially unsafe. And it's a constant rub for me to kind of to have a feet in both worlds. It feels like I would much prefer to have less of a foot in the masculine world. That's just sort of my preference. I'm a more passive individual. I like to have things. I mean, I am a bit more meticulous and have things in a certain order and nature of things. I have a little bit of a perfectionistic brain. Perfectionism is the judgment word we ascribe to it. I'm very precise. And so, there's aspects of that I think, maybe are seen as a little bit more masculine. But by and large, I much prefer to be in a collaborative, open, clear, transparent space because I find a lot of safety in that. I do not like operating on ambiguity or unexpressed emotions and those sorts of things. It's, to me, very stifling. So it's just, sorry, I'm kind of circling here. It's a really interesting rub where I'm very happy where I've landed. And it took, as I've said, a ton of adversity to get to this point of like, I am a little bit more of a feminine creature. I still celebrate the aspects of masculinity therein, but that's my own personal journey, is kind of finding that balance. But by finding the balance that works for me, there's still a rub. And so, it's interesting. It feels like I'm practicing what seems to be the inadvertent expectation of men. Yet even that doesn't feel often like it's good enough for people. which really hurts growing up with a lot of masculine messages, which is like you need to have a right way. Again, that's not the point of masculinity, but I think the inadvertent consequence of how we wield masculinity, at least in my family system, in my area of the country, in the United States, seem to be like you need to do it well, you need to do it right. And here I am still technically not doing it right. And there's a part of me that is in a lot of pain because of that. And I think a big piece of that pain is expressed through depression. And that's the other kind of aspect of my story, that sensitivity I talked about, and the kind of cousin or sibling to the anxiety was crippling depression since I would probably say 8 or 10 years old. Is something that's always been with me. There's something always fundamentally wrong with me that I'm fighting against, and that's been a hard thing to shake, even as I have a firmer sense of myself and who I am and my identity that I've spoken to. Trying to think if there's anything else. Excuse me for any gross noises. Getting over illness here. Masculinity and femininity. Trying to think if there's anything else from a masculine lens that's safe to talk about in a public forum. I mean, safe is, there's things like sexuality is an interesting, but I'm not going to share my sexual kind of stuff on a public forum here. Trying to think. I might have fallen into assertiveness. Trying to think if there's anything else. I mean, the only thing I can think of, there's obviously benefits to all of this. This is where kind of masculinity versus femininity, again, oversexed with gender. I know there's a lot of privilege with being a male. Like my, ability to fall into knowing was not as much of an allowance for women of my age and especially younger. I know when I spoke with my mom, she talked a lot about that growing up in rural Pennsylvania, expect to become a housewife. There's not a lot of place to be going to college or all this sort of pursuit of knowledge stuff. And so it's quite fortunate to be able to fall back on that, because what if I didn't have that? I'd be kind of stuck. Some people, I'm sure, could be in opposite camps where like, gosh, I wished I had those sorts of pursuits, like the physicality piece. Like, oh gosh, I would have loved to have the progression. I usually hear that kind of more from women, because back in the day, right, any more masculine qualities, like, ooh, they're a tomboy, which had this sort of like double-edged sword kind of notion to it, depending on where you lived. And how you were experienced as a tomboy, right? Like tomboys who are attractive get away with it more than tomboys who aren't as attractive, and all this other fun stuff that women have had to deal with over the years. So, and I don't want to sound too much like an apologist here. Hopefully it goes without saying, but I do see some benefits in all of it. My ability to revert to a less emotional state and still be seen as effective, that people would still pursue me relationally. The fact that I would, again, pull back and let people project onto me. I was allowed to be mysterious, right? Which I think is a privilege more afforded to masculinity. So I understand and appreciate those things. And hopefully, I guess you can hear the dialectical both end in this, is that there's a ton of pain in my story. And I really wish that there was more conversation around this, so I could navigate my identity a little bit more safely and a little bit more openly than I did. But at the same time, I had several outs that helped me preserve and keep rolling, which is a good thing. Even if I didn't like the path I ended up on, it was still I had the path to self-preserve to a certain degree, which is a positive for sure. Yeah, I think that's mostly it. I mean, there are certainly other aspects of masculinity I didn't ascribe to, like the womanizing and the, excuse me, and the, seeking power at all costs. I mean, there was definitely prestige. I mean, I think responsibility and prestige is not an inherently bad thing, but it's not unique to masculinity, I don't think either. But yeah, I'm just kind of meandering now. So I'll end there. Hopefully interesting just to hear me, a psychologist, and my experiences with masculinity and the challenges therein. And remember the frame. The only purpose of this episode is just for you to hear from another human being. How did I, growing up in rural Texas, experience masculinity as a male? And how did I deal with it? And what identity did I arrive upon eventually in my life? I guess one thing I didn't say is, what does the future hold for me? But probably not worth it in this episode. So I appreciate you listening. Again, I hope it's curiosity provoking. I hope it provides as a reflection in some way of your own journey, your own path, your own identity. And just really appreciate you being willing to listen to me yap on about me. So as always, stay curious.